This is not an effort to begin firing every deputy that comes across the Professional Standards Committee, because there's a lot of good work, more good work done than bad in this entire agency. But we can't have that very few get a slap on the wrist or get overlooked that divides this community and that divides this agency, because this is also something that is a myth. And I'm going to debunk that today. When these incidents occur, it's not only the community that find them offensive. It's not only the community that visualize it and says that's wrong. So do the men and women that work here.
That was Broward Sheriff Gregory Toney recently announcing a new plan to deal with use of force complaints against deputies in his department. And to discuss this further is Sheriff Toney, who was appointed to the position by Governor Ron DeSantis a year ago to replace Scott Israel, who the governor had removed after the tragedy at Parkland. Sheriff, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me in, Jim. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. So this sort of was a culmination. This announcement that you had was basically a culmination of looking through a number of different things and sort of assessing, the use of force and review of deputies' conduct. Talk to me a little bit more.
Well, I think you nailed it. Coming into the agency, there was a lot of things that I had to instantly start to rectify and fix. It was well documented across the country about the active shooter deficiencies and how horrible we had responded as an agency. I mean, that's why I'm here. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. You absorb an agency that has roughly 5,700 employees, operate over roughly 1,300 square miles, and you start to look at every little intricate detail. And one of the things I noticed was that the Professional Standards Committee that was already in place when I absorbed command wasn't doing things consistently, and some of the disciplinary recommendations that they were forwarding didn't make sense to me or our command staff. And I'll remind you, my command staff was comprised of members who had worked in this organization for 10, 20, 30 plus years. I didn't bring people in here. And so having discussions with my colonels, looking at how the discipline was being issued out, we said we're going to have to change not only the culture, but the construct of the Professional Standards Committee.
When you talk about inconsistencies, what types of things were you seeing? Were you seeing that it was just haphazard, or was there a deliberate tone to what was being done in terms of trying to protect certain things or not?
Combination. So I'll start about the internal side of it and looking at what type of disciplines were recommended. We had an incident where an individual was handcuffed to a bed and didn't have the ability to really hurt, harm, or kill a deputy.
David O'Connell.
David O'Connell. And we're talking about the Deputy Sobrino incident where I had to terminate him. The recommendation that was produced from the Professional Standards Committee was really kind of a slap on the wrist for suspension for a couple of days. That's one of the most deplorable things that we can do, is to strike and assault an individual who's defenseless. And talking to my commanders, when that recommendation came across, I said, well, gosh, here we are again. Another recommendation that doesn't make sense, that isn't measured based on what our expectations are as the sheriff, as the commanders in our organization, as well as what's just kind of a common sense approach in terms of what the expectations would be from the public. And I say that case was compounded also with what had just previously occurred, where I had to look at the Stoneman Douglas incident. And that was one of the worst school shootings in American history in the United States. And the recommendations, again, for deputies who did not go in, for deputies who had failed to fulfill their most fundamental duty, which is to protect. They didn't go in, and the recommendation was, again, for just a few suspensions. And we had to terminate people then. And so you compound that, Jim, with what happened at Stoneman Douglas, what happened with deputies being involved in incidents inside of a medical facility, deputies being involved in terms of striking individuals who are handcuffed inside of our jails, deputies being involved who slammed individuals' face into the ground, deputies being involved with...
That was that 15-year-old kid, DeLuca Roll.
15-year-old DeLuca Roll. And we had to step out and suspend a deputy who choke-slammed a 80-pound-year-old female. And so if we're not going to self-police, how could we build the trust of this relation with this community?
So you had a Professional Standards Committee, and although people were on that committee, you had no role in selecting. You inherited them.
There were two vacancies. Let me give a little bit more clarity. There were two vacancies from the civilian positions. When I came in, I said, well, let's fill those vacancies and put some civilians in. And we put 2 civilians in to make sure we had a full staff. The Professional Standards Committee is allotted up to 11 individuals to sit. Some are law enforcement, some are civilians, so on and so forth. And so we filled it. But no one ever interviewed, from my command staff, no one had ever interviewed the law enforcement personnel, no one had interviewed the civilians. And I said, wait a minute, how can I, as the sheriff of this organization, institute a professional standards committee and personnel where I don't even know them, where I haven't established these
So
standards.
you ended up replacing everybody.
Hit the reset button. That's correct.
You know,
This
and you
March.
brought in an array of people, different people, who you think will be a better fit for that organization.
Yeah, I think people who have a look. I said this the other day. It's called a professional standards committee. So I wanted to try to professionalize it a little bit more by examining the type of civilians that we were bringing in. So we have members now who are seated on this professional standards committee who have backgrounds as U.S. assistant attorneys, labor management professionals who can come in.
And a little bit more reflective of the community as well.
And a little bit more reflective of the community. Absolutely. We brought in more women, we brought in more minorities, but it wasn't a matter of just being reflective, but really looking at the qualifications.
Well, so explain to me the difference between that panel and the Use of Force Review Board. What does the Use of Force Review Board do?
Sure. So those are two totally different elements. What typically happens, Jim, with our internal affairs investigation practices, once that investigation is completed and we're doing evidence gathering, we always kind of go, especially when it's being the application of force, we always go back and speak to our subject matter expert, our defensive tactics instructor, our guy who can tell us yes or no, does this look like it's in compliance in terms of our policies, training, protocols, etc. That's an enormous amount of pressure to be placed on one individual, the same individual who's responsible for training the deputies. And so I came out of an organization that did things a little bit differently, and I looked at some of our larger metropolitan organizations across the country. And what they introduced is a use of force review board, so that it's not one single individual deputy who's responsible for training the deputies who's determining whether or not they're in compliance. So now 7 law enforcement professionals will examine every single case that comes through when there's a use of force allegation. And this isn't unique. This isn't something that, you know, Sheriff Tony just snatched out of the air. This is going on across the country.
And define use of force. What does that term mean?
When we're starting to simplify it, anytime our deputies are involved in where they have to apply their hands on someone, have to use their taser, have to use their OC spray, anything that's involved in some type of impact to an individual.
Up to and including discharging their weapon?
Up to and including discharging their weapon. And it's not always having to strike an individual. If we fire our weapon and miss, that still is going to go through our use of force review board, as well as our entire policies and protocols, and even find its way through the professional standards committee.
Up next, more of my interview with Sheriff Tony.